man known to history as Alphonse Gabriel Capone, was born on the 17th of January 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, in the United States of America. His father was Gabriele Capone, a barber who immigrated from Angri, a small village just outside of Naples in southern Italy, along with his wife, Alphonse's mother, Teresa Capone, born Teresa Raiola, a seamstress who would have 9 children with Gabriele. The couple arrived at Brooklyn in 1893, having first immigrated to the port of Rijeka in Austria-Hungary, present-day Croatia. Their first residence in New York was 95 Navy Street in the Navy Yard area of downtown Brooklyn. They were hardly alone here as newly arrived Italians. The 1890s, 1900s and 1910s were the absolute peak of the mass migration of Italians to the United States, with nearly 4 million in all entering the US during these decades, seeking to escape desperate poverty, overpopulation, and a lack of opportunities in the home country. The Capones soon moved from Navy Street to Park Slope in Brooklyn in 1909 when Alphonse was 11 years old. He had 8 brothers and sisters: Vincenzo, who became a prohibition agent, changing his name to Richard Hart to avoid association with his criminal brother; Raffaele James, known as Bottles, who would go on to control his brother's liquor empire; Salvatore, known as Frank, who would also work for his brother Al; a sister, Ermina, who died at the age of 1; Ermino, known as John, as well as Albert, Matthew, and a surviving sister, Mafalda Capone. When he started at school, Alphonse showed promise as a student, bringing home excellent results to his proud parents. But he struggled keeping the rules of his strict Roman Catholic background and would be expelled from school at the age of 14 for striking a female teacher in the face. After this incident, his formal schooling stopped, but his education into the criminal world was just beginning. Working odd jobs such as helping in a bowling alley and a sweet store around crime-filled Brooklyn would come to be his occupation from this tender age. The people who influenced him at this stage were gangsters such as Johnny Torrio, an Italian-born gangster known for his unassuming and shrewd character who Capone came to admire and saw as a mentor. Criminal influences were an everyday part of life in Brooklyn at the time, and Al soon pursued that path, joining small-time gangs such as the Bowery Boys and the Junior 40 Thieves in Lower Manhattan, after which he joined the Brooklyn Rippers and eventually the 5 Points Gang, the most powerful gang of the time in Lower Manhattan. These criminal gangs were organized, and many had existed for decades at that point. There was, however, no national syndicate of the Italian-American mafia to speak of at this early stage in the 20th century. More a loose conglomeration of gangs in New York and elsewhere that sometimes acted in common interest with one another. By 1917, Al's employer and mentor was Frankie Yale, a protection racketeer and general hoodlum who demanded payments from local businesses in order to protect them, or, as was more often the case, to prevent him from harming them himself. Using funds from his racketeering operations, Yale opened up a bar called the Harvard Inn in Coney Island, where Al worked for Frankie as a bartender and doorman. It was during this time that Capone would acquire the nickname which he hated, Scarface. One evening, while he was working as a doorman at the Harvard Inn, he got into a fight with a local gangster, one Frankie Galluccio, after inadvertently upsetting his vivacious and beautiful sister Lena by insulting her with a misjudged compliment. In the resulting drunken clash, Galluccio slashed Capone with a knife, leaving a noticeable scar on the left side of his face for the rest of his life. Capone was always conscious of this scar, and whenever photographs were taken of him, he tried to ensure that they were taken from the other side to avoid the mark being seen. He also claimed it was a war wound, gained from, quote, a German gunner in the trenches of the First World War, a clear falsehood given that Capone had never served in the war. A more favoured nickname for Al was one given to him by his closest friends, which was Snorky, a name at the time for a smart dresser. Other nicknames he would hold over the course of his life included Big Al, Big Boy, and of course, Public Enemy Number 1. Following this incident with Frankie Galluccio, Capone was anxious for revenge, although he was forced to make a surface reconciliation with the local villain instead by other high-ranking gangsters. Galluccio apologized for causing the scar, and Capone promised not to seek retribution against him, a promise which he stuck to even when he became a mob boss himself. One reason Al decided to reconcile with Galluccio was that he recognized his own fault in the matter and saw that Galluccio was merely protecting his own family. Family was everything to many Italian-American gangsters of this time, and so when Al's girlfriend, May Josephine Coughlin, gave birth to Al's son, Albert Francis Sonny Capone, in December 1918, the only thing to be done was for the pair to marry, which they did only a few weeks later on the 30th of December. May had been working in a local department store when she met Al, and when he married this Irish Catholic girl, he was only 19 and she was 21. Because he was under the legal age required, he had to obtain the consent of his parents in writing in order to marry. Their marriage would be a very happy one right up until the end, despite Al's perennial unfaithfulness. Shortly after his marriage to May, Al was asked by Johnny Torrio to make the move to Chicago. Torrio had been invited to the Windy City by Vincenzo Colosimo, better known as Big Jim. Colosimo was one of the first Italian-American crime bosses in Chicago. Born in southern Italy all the way back in 1878, he migrated from the Old Country to the US in 1895 and headed out to Chicago. As early as 1902, he was running a criminal organization there that engaged in racketeering, prostitution, and illegal gambling. He was a powerful Chicago figure, but by the late 1910s, as new outfits emerged in the city, he needed enforcers to help him keep control of his turf. He invited Torrio, who had lived between New York and Chicago throughout the 1910s and who had worked for Colosimo in the past, to again come out west and work for him by the Great Lakes. Torrio then asked Al Capone to join him. Al was happy to oblige his friend, as well as make a new start for him and his family in the Windy City. And so in 1919, Capone left Brooklyn for Chicago and began working as a bouncer in a brothel. It appears to be not long after he arrived at Chicago that Capone, who was never faithful to his wife, contracted syphilis from an unidentified partner, most likely one of the prostitutes who worked in the brothel he was working as a bouncer at. This would have major implications for him. Syphilis is a bacterial infection that is typically transmitted through sexual contact. Like many other sexually transmitted diseases, it results in immediate symptoms like a rash or warty growths around the genitals, as well as a fever and swollen glands. However, even after the initial illness recedes, the infection remains in the system. It will often remain largely dormant for about a decade after the initial period of infection, something which makes it difficult to detect, or at least certainly did so in the 1920s. Over a period of years, it is devastating if untreated, impacting many different parts of the body, such as a person's eyesight, heart, and their brain. A severe case will eventually cause brain damage, heart attacks, and kill the person. Capone's case was serious, and as we will see, it, rather than the forces of American law enforcement, would eventually be the true demise of Al Capone. It appears, with hindsight, that treatment with a drug called Salvarsan, which had just recently become available in the United States, could probably have cured Capone. But he seemingly never sought treatment until it was much too late to reverse the worst effects of the condition. While Capone's time in Chicago had started badly in terms of contracting syphilis, things were about to get much better in terms of his criminal prospects. Even while he was heading out west from New York to Chicago in 1919, the United States Congress was managing the passage into law of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, one which called for a prohibition on the unlicensed production, transport, or sale of alcohol on a federal level. The Volstead Act, as it was colloquially known, was passed by Congress in January 1919 and officially became law a year later at the beginning of 1920. Although it was in part a result of decades of campaigning by the temperance movement and the Anti-Saloon League in the US, prohibition was also very much directed against groups like the Irish, Italians, and Germans, who had arrived in large numbers to the US ever since the middle of the 19th century and who had monopolized the bar and saloon trade in a great many regions. However, short of putting these people out of business, prohibition would only drive the production, transport, and sale of alcohol underground. In doing so, it acted as a catalyst for the emergence of new criminal organizations all over the US, especially so in New York, Chicago, and other cities where there were already Italian and Irish gangs. The Italian mafia in the United States was very much born out of prohibition, and Al Capone would soon be its leading figure in Chicago. Within months of prohibition beginning, Big Jim Colosimo was killed in Chicago under circumstances that remain mysterious, though Capone was probably not involved. This provided the opportunity for Torrio to step up and take over from him as one of the leading crime bosses in the city, and in turn for Capone to gain quick promotion from working as a bouncer to become one of Torrio's captains. Within a short period of time, he was in charge of a major bootlegging operation. The primary way in which this functioned in Chicago in the 1920s was to run liquor down from Canada, where it could still legally be produced and transported in many places, though Canada was also experimenting with prohibition in several different provinces over the border to Chicago. The Great Lakes, which form the border between Canada and the US all around Chicago, were impossible for prohibition officials to police, and there was a great amount of money to be made once the alcohol made it to Chicago. Alternatively, stills were set up to produce it closer to home, and speakeasies, the name for small illegal bars, were established to distribute the booze. It was, for instance, very easy to set up stills in the thinly populated Dakota Plains, and then bring it from there to Chicago. Before long, Torrio, Capone, and their followers were making truly staggering sums of money as the Roaring Twenties got going, and people all across America continued to drink. On top of this, Capone engaged in racketeering, gambling, prostitution, and anything else which offered a handsome profit for those willing to take the risk. Meanwhile, life for the Capone family in Chicago was going well. In 1923, Al purchased a small house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue in Park Manor on the south side of the city for $5,500. He also began acting as a boxing promoter, but this was merely a front for his more illegal activities with what became known as the Chicago Outfit or the South Side Gang. Capone had a penchant for the high life, wearing expensive bespoke suits, smoking cigars, and eating only the best food. He also had a liking for female company and was known to wear expensive, showy jewelry. Unlike many other gangsters of the era who tried to stay under the radar, Capone reveled in the attention he received, such as being cheered at his arrival at ball games. The general impression is of a figure who believed that he was a modern-day Robin Hood, making charitable donations from his vast illicit wealth. When questioned about his activities and lifestyle, his dismissive response might be, quote, "I am just a businessman, giving the people what they want," or "all I do is satisfy a public demand." In 1923, a change in the mechanics of Chicago's underworld came about owing to political developments in the city. A reformer by the name of William Emmett Dever was elected as mayor of Chicago. To avoid potential interference and investigation into their affairs, Capone and Torrio decided to move their base of operations to the Chicago suburbs and the town of Cicero, Illinois. Capone based himself and the rest of the South Side Gang there, from where he continued to grow their operation. They set up illicit brothels, speakeasies, and gambling dens, and expanded the liquor operation to supply all of Cicero's saloons, even using bribery and intimidation to take over local town elections, such as the 1924 Cicero municipal elections. This veneer of establishment respectability made it difficult for the North Side Gang, a rival criminal organization, to get to him, and was an opportunity for Capone to not only protect himself from rival gangs who sought to take over his rum-running operation, but to also prevent the election of more reformist politicians. The incumbent mayor of Cicero at the time was the corrupt Republican Party politician Joseph Z. Klenner, who along with his bipartisan administration had experienced hardly any opposition in recent elections, running Cicero by then for 3 consecutive terms. The corrupt administration had been controlled by the South Side Gang, with the help of Al's brother Salvatore, better known as Frank. But in 1924, the Democratic Party decided it would mount a challenge and run its own candidates in the elections in Cicero, mounting a serious challenge to the status quo with their threat to clean up the town. The 1st of April 1924 was the date set for the election, but Klenner had decided he needed a little help to secure a win, and so he effectively offered Torrio, Capone, and the Chicago outfit immunity from prosecution in Cicero if they helped ensure his election. Capone and his cronies were only too happy to oblige and brought in 200 men, members of his own gang, plus men from other allied gangs to help out. The gang began a targeted campaign of stabbings, shootings, kidnappings, and general intimidation to make sure that Klenner was elected mayor once again. This even included an assault on the Democratic nominee for the position of town clerk, William K. Pflaum, on the eve of the election. Pflaum's face was beaten and his offices ransacked. As well as this, his wife was thrown against a wall. The terror continued the following day, the 1st of April, Election Day, when the voters faced submachine guns and sawn-off shotguns at the polling booths to ensure that their votes were cast for Klenner. When their votes were for him, they were allowed to vote multiple times, but those who dared to resist and voted for someone else for mayor were either prevented from voting again or were beaten. As well as this, cars were patrolling the streets filled with Capone's gunmen, and several individuals were targeted, such as Democratic politician Rudolph Hurt, who was standing for mayor as well, and whose campaign headquarters was sprayed with gunfire. His fellow Democrat, the challenger for the post of city clerk, was pistol-whipped in front of his family and his supporters. Then, in the campaign headquarters of another opponent, Frank Capone, Al's brother, beat up several campaign officials. The chaos continued, with polling stations being raided and ballots snatched from voters' hands. Some voters were even shot or stabbed or beaten by so-called sluggers in the street, while one campaign official called Joseph Price was tied up and gagged before being battered by the gangsters. Another Democratic official named Stanley Stenkovich was taken to a Chicago basement, blindfolded, and kept there until after the polling stations had closed to prevent him from voting. A police officer was beaten after being disarmed of his gun. As successful as these efforts to subvert the Illinois elections were, they were not without a price for Al and the wider Capone family. One Democrat, a campaigner named Michael Gavin, was shot in both of his legs and kept with 8 other campaign workers in the basement of a mob-owned Chicago hotel to prevent them from voting. When a call for help from the campaigners finally reached Cook County Judge Edmund K. Jaretsky late that afternoon, he sent 70 Chicago police officers, made up of 5 squads of detectives and 9 squads of police in vehicles, to help subdue the chaos and confusion in Cicero. The police response included a squad car, carrying both uniformed police and detectives, who spotted Al and his brother Frank, as well as henchmen such as Dave Hedlin and Charles Fischetti. Straight away, the policemen jumped out of the car with drawn weapons, and a gun battle ensued between the men, during which Frank Capone was shot and killed, while Hedlin was wounded. Al escaped, as did Fischetti, who later surrendered himself. Al gave his brother a lavish funeral. The flowers were provided by local bootlegger Dean O'Banion, who used a florist business as a cover for his illegal operations and cost $20,000 alone. O'Banion would soon feature in Capone's story again. The mourners wailed for the loss of one so young, but observing from a distance were the very same police officers who had shot and killed Frank Capone. An occupational hazard for Capone in his time as boss of the mob in Cicero were the many attempts on his life from other gang members, as well as the threat of arrest at any time. His bribery and corruption of local politicians safeguarded him to a certain extent, but he and his entourage were still vulnerable. Thus, Al was very security conscious. Indeed, in the early 1920s, Capone's driver was found tortured and murdered, and Jaime Weiss narrowly escaped from an attempt on his life in the Chicago Loop, the business district of downtown Chicago. All the while, Torrio and Capone aimed to remain as the largest crime syndicate in Chicago and the wider Illinois region. They faced competition from a number of groups, notably the North Side Gang and the Jenner Brothers. The Jenner Brothers were allied with Torrio, as was Dean O'Banion, an Irish-American bootlegger and head of the North Side Gang. The Jenner Brothers had begun selling cheap booze to O'Banion's customers. Not only did Torrio seem to ignore what was going on, he also either sanctioned or arranged himself for the murder of O'Banion at his flower shop on the 10th of November 1924 by Brooklyn crime boss Frankie Yale and Jenner gunman Albert Anselmi and John Scalise. O'Banion had been known for his bizarre behavior, his childlike wide grin, and a tendency to over-exuberantly slap people he had just met on the back. He had gunned down a man in front of crowds for no good reason, and killed a man he met at Al's club, the Four Deuces, bringing unwanted attention to the gangsters. When he tricked Torrio, who was incredibly risk and publicity averse, into being present at his brewery when he knew a raid was about to occur, an action which ended in Torrio's arrest, it sealed O'Banion's fate, and Torrio ordered his execution. This resulted in a change of the hierarchy at the top of the North Side gang. It was now headed by Jaime Weiss, with the help of his second-in-commands, Vincent Drucci and Bugs Moran. As O'Banion had been a good friend of Jaime Weiss, the Northsiders had only one thing on their mind by this point, and that was revenge. This was the beginning of what would be a bitter 5-year gang war between the primarily Italian-American Chicago outfit and the largely Irish-American North Side gang. In January 1925, it came as no surprise when first Capone was ambushed by the Northsiders, an incident from which he escaped unharmed, though shaken up by the experience, and then only 12 days later, Torrio himself was shot when returning from a shopping trip, the experience leaving him deeply affected. At that juncture, Torrio, who was entering his mid-40s and who had made a lot of money over a 20-year-long criminal career, decided to effectively retire, handing control of the Chicago outfit over to Capone just as he turned 26. There was a further attack on Capone from the North Side gang on the 20th of September 1926 when they attempted to draw Al to the window of his Hawthorne Inn headquarters. Several gunmen opened fire on the first floor of the restaurant with Thompson's submachine guns, firing over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Miraculously, Capone was unharmed, though he was fazed by this latest attack and reached out to the heads of the North Side gang to call for a truce. Negotiations took place, but achieved nothing. Only 3 weeks after this, the head of the North Side gang, Jaime Weiss, was killed by Capone's men outside the very flower shop that had been owned by Dean O'Banion, which now acted as the North Side headquarters. In January 1927, the owner of Hawthorne's restaurant, who was a good friend of Capone's, was killed in retaliation by Bugs Moran and Drucci after being kidnapped by them. The continuation of the turf wars prompted further security measures as Capone began spending more time away from Chicago. It was not unusual for the whole Capone entourage to turn up at a Chicago train station and hire a complete Pullman sleeper car to take them on various breaks to places such as Little Rock, Hot Springs, Kansas City, Omaha, or Cleveland for a week in a luxurious hotel. They would book such trips using false names. As a more permanent retreat, Capone purchased a 14-room mansion in 1928, which he beefed up the security on. Capone also paid $40,000 to the Anheuser-Busch brewing family, the producers of Budweiser, who were in difficult circumstances during Prohibition, for a mansion at 93 Palm Avenue on Palm Island in Biscayne Bay, Miami, Florida. The house was not registered in Capone's name, and neither would any other property be. In fact, Capone didn't even have a bank account. Instead, he used Western Union for cash deliveries. Conversely, he was a prolific contributor to charitable causes and even helped set up a soup kitchen in Chicago during the early stages of the Great Depression in 1930. All moves intended to bolster his popularity with the common people. Capone also used political alliances to gather allies within the political world in a more subtle way than his infamous election interference in Cicero back in 1924. For example, he supported William Hale Thompson with a donation of $250,000 when the Republican candidate for the 1927 mayoral election for Chicago hinted that he was sympathetic to those charged with bootlegging offenses and other breaches of the Volstead Act. He was also an extremely eccentric politician who courted the Irish and Italian Roman Catholic vote and appealed to residual anti-British sentiment in the country through a bizarre array of rhetoric concerning King George V of Britain. Despite his unusual methods, Thompson, who today is viewed as one of the most corrupt politicians in American political history, beat his reformist rival William Emmett Dever and became mayor of Chicago. He continued to receive the support of Capone, which allowed their mutually profitable relationship to continue right up until 1929, when an event, which later became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, was to crack Capone's thin veneer of legitimacy altogether. It brought to an end the informal immunity from police prosecution he had enjoyed through his alliance with Thompson. Incidentally, after he died in 1944, Thompson was found to have safe deposit boxes with millions of dollars stashed in them, much of which was surely bribes paid by Capone. Bugs Moran continued to be a thorn in the side of Capone and was now the leader of the North Side Gang following the death of Jaime Weiss. As well as being competition for each other's bootlegging operations, Moran disliked the fact that Capone was involved in prostitution rackets, as it was against his Catholic principles. The continuing tit-for-tat attacks and killings between Capone's Chicago outfit and Moran's North Side Gang came to a head on the morning of Thursday the 14th of February 1929, the day of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone had hatched a plan against Moran, whereby an apartment was rented across the road from Moran's headquarters and the movements of his men were watched. Capone then arranged for a phone call on the 13th of February, one in which Moran was told that there was to be a delivery of whiskey from Detroit the following day at a bargain price. He thus agreed to buy it and asked for the delivery at 10:30 a.m. the next morning at the SMC Cartage Company on North Clark Street, where his bootleg operation vehicles were kept. However, when the truck arrived, Capone had arranged for a fake police raid to take place, with 2 gunmen dressed in plain clothes and 2 dressed as Chicago police officers. They lined up 7 of Moran's men against a wall, supposedly to search them, but when a signal was given, the men were mown down in cold blood. Moran himself escaped the attack, having slept in that morning, despite having been the main target of the hit, but the fallout of the hit for Capone, especially when the photographs of the slain victims were published, was a decline in his image and standing with the public. It also earned him the new nickname Public Enemy No. 1, as the federal authorities now began to intervene in a problem which Illinois seemed to be incapable of handling on its own. There were also many questions for Mayor Thompson. Moran's reaction to the complete carnage of the attack was to break the gangster's code himself and inform the police that it was Capone who arranged the attack. This resulted in a summons to court for Capone to answer the charges arrayed against him. He denied all responsibility and claimed he was sick and so could not attend court. This happened twice, and eventually, because there was no direct evidence to tie him to the massacre, the charges were dropped. It seemed as though Capone's tactics had worked. Yet on this occasion, law enforcement was determined to bring him down, and would utilize whatever means necessary to do so. Al Capone was known as someone who let others do his dirty work for him, but one story persists which suggests that wasn't always true. This story starts with a dinner and a night of drinking for several of Capone's men, including Scalise, Anselmi, and Junta, 3 men who Capone believed had been conspiring against him with another gangster. The story goes that after luring them into a trap, Capone himself beat the men about the head with a baseball bat before ordering his men to shoot them. Still, some historians have questioned the veracity of this story, although it was reported in the newspapers at the time, and one associate of Capone's claimed to have witnessed both the planning of the attack and the incident itself firsthand. Stories like these about shocking violence perpetrated by either Capone or his men working on his orders contributed to a kind of legend developing around him by the late 1920s. He was viewed as a somewhat unstable character, prone to outbursts, jealousy, violence, and erratic behavior. In assessing this, we should bear in mind that he was a heavy drinker and drug abuser. Although we more normally associate drugs as being a problem in the United States from the 1970s onwards, Class A narcotics were traded illicitly as early as the 1920s, with many people getting a taste for using the drugs recreationally as early as the late 19th century, when certain drugs were in widespread use in hospital settings as anesthetics and were not heavily regulated. Capone became a habitual drug user in the 1920s, so much so that he eventually ended up with a deviated septum. When combined with hard liquor, narcotics can result in a paranoid and violent character and may go some way to explaining some of Capone's conduct as the head of the Chicago underworld for much of the Prohibition era. All of this being said, there was another side to Al Capone, one which is rarely reported on. He was, for instance, very protective of his son, Sonny, who had been born with a hearing defect and who Al and May ensured would get the best care possible to try and work around his difficulties, venturing as far afield as New York to visit the specialists there. Capone also had a great love of music, and this ranged between numerous genres. After acquiring a phonograph to play records in the 1920s, he liked nothing better than to lie around listening to operas, and would even study them, writing out lyrics and sometimes even coming up with his own alternate versions. After a long enough period of time, he considered that he was knowledgeable enough about them that he started attending operas in Chicago's theaters, accompanied by his bodyguards. Urban legend has it that during one performance, Al's bodyguards got up to leave during a performance, believing it was over, at which point Capone turned around and chastised them, explaining that it ain't over till the fat lady sings. Whether this is the origin of the phrase is, of course, debatable. His musical tastes were more contemporary too, and he was fond of the jazz scene that was synonymous with the 1920s. This famously led to one of Chicago's greatest jazz players, Thomas Waller, being kidnapped by some of Al's men in January 1926. Waller believed he was going to be killed and was relieved to find when the individuals who had captured him brought him to the Hawthorne Inn that he in fact had only been brought there to play some tunes for Capone's 27th birthday celebrations. During 1929, attempts to bring Public Enemy No. 1 to justice intensified, and on the 27th of March 1929, agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrested Capone as he left a courtroom after testifying to a grand jury investigating Prohibition law violations. On this occasion, the charge which the FBI brought against Capone was that he had feigned illness in order to avoid earlier prosecution. Then, on the 16th of May 1929, Capone was arrested again, this time in Philadelphia, on a charge of carrying a concealed weapon. On this occasion, he was sent to trial and found guilty, and received a sentence of 1 year in prison. Thus, on the 8th of August 1929, Capone was sent to Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. He was released in March 1930 after serving just 7 months, but in April 1930, just weeks after his release, Capone was arrested on vagrancy charges whilst visiting Miami Beach. During his arrest, Capone claimed that the police had threatened his family and refused him food and water. He was then further charged with perjury for making these claims. After a 3-day trial in July, he was found not guilty. The government, though, was not willing to relent now, and so, in February 1931, Capone faced another trial, this time on the charge of contempt of court due to his illness claims. Judge James Herbert Wilkerson made a point of minutely questioning the testimony of Capone's doctor, thus aiding the prosecutor, and Capone was sentenced to 6 months in prison. He remained free for the time being while the case was being appealed, yet there is no doubt that the walls were closing in on Alphonse Capone. Throughout these legal difficulties, Capone was peripherally involved in some of the most important developments in the history of the Italian-American Mafia. These were primarily occurring in New York City and New Jersey, though other syndicates as far west as Chicago had been dragged into affairs as well. In November 1928, Arnold Rothstein, a Jewish-American gangster who had acted as a kind of overseer of the New York crime world throughout the 1920s, keeping the peace between various factions, had been killed over an unpaid debt. Thereafter, Joe Masseria had stepped into the breach as the head of the Italian-American groups, allying with Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and several others like Frank Costello and Vito Genovese. Then, to complicate matters further, another recently arrived Sicilian by the name of Salvatore Maranzano began to try to muscle out Masseria. A mob war followed, known as the Castellamarese War, after the town of Castellammare del Golfo, where Maranzano hailed from in Sicily. In this, Capone allied with Masseria, but he was only able to offer a very limited amount of support. Such were his own legal difficulties at the time. As it turned out, Luciano turned on Masseria and ordered the murder of his old boss, following which he briefly went to work for Maranzano before killing him too, after Maranzano tried to establish himself as boss of bosses. It was at this juncture that Luciano called together the heads of the different New York syndicates, as well as those in Buffalo and Chicago, and formed the Commission to adjudicate over the affairs of the 5 New York families and other branches of Italian-American Mafia going forward, without an overall boss of bosses. It is often assumed that Al Capone was briefly a member of the commission representing Chicago, though in reality he was before the courts in Chicago at the time on serious charges, and exactly who the Chicago head would be was still up in the air. Back in Chicago, as the Castellamarese War was underway, law enforcement, in conjunction with the police in Miami, were trying every which way they could to bring Capone to justice. Around this time, the Assistant Attorney General, Mabel Walker Willibrand, realized that there might be an orthodox way of bringing Capone to justice. She saw that the luxurious lifestyles of the mobsters were not fully supported by their legal earnings. Many of these individuals barely filed tax returns,
let alone were able to account for why they owned mansions in Chicago and Florida. Mabel came up with the idea of prosecuting the gangsters for tax evasion. That way, they could be convicted without the very difficult-to-acquire evidence of their other illegal deeds and violent crimes. She tried out this approach in the case of United States versus Sullivan, a case launched against Manly Sullivan, an illegal bootlegger. Sullivan was found guilty of tax evasion, though had the case successfully appealed on the basis of the Fifth Amendment. This provided a trial run for how Capone could be convicted if the Fifth Amendment could be circumvented.
The Internal Revenue Service, or IRS, chose Frank J. Wilson to investigate Capone's tax matters, focusing on his spending in relation to his stated income. The key to gaining a conviction would be finding proof of his income and the disparity between it and the amount of tax Capone had paid. Unwittingly, Capone undermined himself when he offered to pay tax on a certain amount of income, admitting in the process that he was in fact guilty of non-payment. His lawyers had been ordered by Capone to get his tax position into good order, and so they declared income that was taxable for 1928 and 1929 of $100,000 for each year. As he hadn't paid tax on that amount, the declaration was in effect an admission of guilt. On the 13th of March 1931, Capone was charged with income tax evasion for the year of 1924, and then on the 5th of June, Capone was indicted by a federal grand jury to stand trial on 22 counts of income tax evasion running from 1925 to 1929. At that point, he was released on bail of $50,000. A week after the charges were lodged against Capone, Elliot Ness, a seemingly incorruptible prohibition enforcement agent, and his team were to become involved with the court process. Ness was a member of the U.S. Treasury Department, which he joined in 1926, working within the Bureau of Prohibition in Chicago, and so he was part of the team whose job it was to take down Al Capone by investigating his illegal bootlegging activities and gathering evidence of conspiracy to violate the National Prohibition or Volstead Act. He led raids of Capone's illegal stills and breweries, destroying his supply chain and leading to an estimated loss of $9 million in income for Capone.
By the end of their investigations, getting much of their information through innovative use of wiretaps on phone lines, the operation headed by Ness caused major financial damage and disruption to Capone's operation and collected evidence for an incredible 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act. Ness now brought forward this huge body of evidence against Capone just as the tax evasion charges were landing him before court as well. It was then perhaps unsurprising that when Capone stood before Judge James Herbert Wilkerson on the 16th of June 1931, the same judge who had already convicted Capone's brother Ralph for tax evasion in 1930 and imprisoned him for 3 years, Capone decided to plead guilty to the charges in return for a plea deal in which he was sentenced to just 2.5 years.
Capone had seemingly escaped with a slap on the wrist, given the huge amount of evidence against him. However, when it came to sentencing, Judge Wilkerson refused to honor the plea bargain. Therefore, on the 30th of July 1931, Capone's counsel retracted the guilty pleas, and an argument was made that a lawyer could not confess for his client, with Capone's legal counsel arguing that they could not legally have admitted the income. Judge Wilkerson overruled the objection on the grounds that any statement made to a government official through legal counsel was done so at the person's own risk. He consequently ruled that the letter to federal authorities admitting his earlier income could be admitted into evidence. Wilkerson subsequently tried Capone on the income tax evasion charges alone, deeming them to take precedence over the violations of the Volstead Act. The lawyers acting for Capone had only hours to prepare for the trial, as they had been relying on the judge accepting the plea bargain deal. In the end, all they could offer was the flimsy defense that Capone's income had been intrinsically connected to his severe gambling habit. This was a weak defense. Not only were gambling losses only admissible as a deduction from gambling winnings, but Capone's expenses showed that money must have been available to pay for the bets placed. Thus, if he had lost money by gambling, then his income prior thereto had to have been even higher than initially supposed. The extent of Capone's spending was then outlined in court in great detail by the prosecution, resulting in the modest conclusion that $215,000 in taxes had been evaded on a gross income of $1,038,654 over a 5-year period. With this established, on the 31st of October 1931, Al Capone was convicted on 3 counts of income tax evasion. A week later, he received his sentence, which was to be 11 years in federal prison and a fine of $50,000 plus $7,692 in costs. As well as this, he would also be liable for the $215,000 back taxes plus interest. Capone's response to his conviction was to hire a team of expert tax lawyers from Washington. They filed a writ of habeas corpus, which meant that the detainee had to be brought to court to investigate if the detention was lawful. The grounds which they used for the argument was the precedent of a Supreme Court ruling in which it had been pronounced that tax evasion was not fraud, which would mean that the time limit for the prosecution of tax evasion might have expired on some of the tax years Capone was convicted for, owing to the statute of limitations. However, the judge decided that the time Capone had spent in Miami during the 1920s and early 1930s should be deducted from the age of the offenses committed within the state of Illinois, making the argument invalid, and thus denying the appeal for both the conviction and the sentence. Following this failed appeal, Capone was sent to Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary on the 3rd of May 1932 at the age of 33. Elliot Ness was among the federal agents who accompanied Capone from the Cook County Jail to the penitentiary. This was the only time that the two men were known to have actually met in person. When Capone arrived there, he weighed 250 pounds, and at the medical assessment he was recorded as being diagnosed with both syphilis and gonorrhea, as well as a perforated nasal septum due to his years of excessive drug use. He was also suffering from withdrawal symptoms as the supply of narcotics was leaving his system. Whilst in Atlanta, Capone was competent in his job of stitching soles onto shoes, but he was not popular with fellow inmates, who felt he was both a weak personality, unable to deal with the bullying the other inmates carried out, and also was receiving special treatment. This perception arose from the protection he was offered by his cellmate Red Rudensky, a seasoned criminal who was associated with the South Side Gang, who had decided that Capone, whose health was severely deteriorating owing to his syphilitic condition, needed his aid. Between the hatred he was facing from other inmates, the incoherence of the letters he was writing home, as well as Red Rudensky's concerns that he would have a breakdown, it was decided that Capone would be moved to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary off the coast of San Francisco in August 1934. His new address was to be Cell 181. In Alcatraz on the 23rd of June 1936, Capone was attacked in the laundry area by fellow inmate James Crittenden Lucas, who was serving a life sentence for bank robbery. Lucas stabbed Capone in the back with a pair of scissors, stolen from the prison barber. Capone was only superficially wounded and was able to throw Lucas against a wall in retaliation. After the attack, Lucas was sent into solitary confinement as a punishment. During his time at Alcatraz, Capone's syphilis worsened, affecting his mental faculties until, in February 1938, he was diagnosed formally with syphilis of the brain. Thus, the final year of his Alcatraz sentence was spent in the hospital ward of the prison, where he was both disoriented and confused. When he was released from Alcatraz on the 6th of January 1939, he was immediately transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution on Terminal Island in California to fulfill his sentence for contempt of court. He was given parole on the 16th of November 1939, after his wife May appealed to the court on the grounds of his reduced mental capacity. Meanwhile, in Chicago, the Southside Gang had come under the control of Frank Nitti, one of Capone's former bodyguards who had gradually risen in the 1920s to handle much of the money flow and operations. He had served a jail term himself for tax evasion. It was after he was released in March 1932 that he became acting and then de facto head of the Chicago outfit. Under Nitti's leadership, the Chicago outfit continued their crime business in a much more discreet manner. This approach meant that it was unclear to many who was actually in control of the organization. Still, organized crime continued, with prostitution, gambling, loan sharking, and labor union racketeering all continuing after Prohibition came to an end in 1933. On the 16th of November 1939, Capone was released from prison due to the state of his health. He was referred to the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. However, they refused to take him in, based on his reputation. He was instead admitted to the Union Memorial Hospital for treatment of paresis, which was caused by late-stage syphilis. As a mark of his thanks, Capone donated 2 Japanese weeping cherry trees to the hospital. He left the Baltimore hospital on the 20th of March 1940 to return home to Palm Island in Florida. He was lucky enough to be one of the first patients treated in America with the recently released drug penicillin. Although it was too late to cure his condition and reverse the damage to his brain, it did help to slow down the progression of the disease. In Palm Island, he was cared for by his wife May. Despite his fall from grace 10 years earlier, his repeated infidelities during the 1920s, and the fact that he quite possibly transmitted his syphilis to her, ensuring that they did not have any further children after Sonny was born in 1918, she remained committed to him and had traveled long distances to visit him throughout his many years in prison. May would look after him for over half a decade after he was released from prison, as his condition continued to deteriorate. During the final years, Capone was examined by a Baltimore psychiatrist, as well as his own physician, who concluded that he had a mental age of a 12-year-old. On the 21st of January 1947, Capone suffered a stroke from which he initially started to recover, before contracting bronchopneumonia. He then suffered a cardiac arrest on the 22nd of January, and on the 25th of January 1947, having just turned 48 years of age a week earlier, Al Capone died of heart failure as a result of apoplexy. He was in his home surrounded by his loved ones. A private funeral was held in Chicago a week later, and he was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago. 3 years later, in 1950, his remains, along with the remains of his father Gabriele and his brother Salvatore, were exhumed and reinterred at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois.
Capone's death brought to an end a chapter in the history of Chicago. Although by the time he died in 1947, it had been a great many years since he played any role in the city's criminal underworld. Still, his legacy was felt there for many years after his downfall at the beginning of the 1930s. Capone, more so than anyone else, certainly not Big Jim Colosimo or Johnny Torrio, two level-headed criminal bosses, transformed Chicago into one of the most violent cities in North America through his confrontational approach to his rivals and his willingness to use exemplary violence.
This had an impact on the criminal culture of the city at large. Prohibition might have been coming to an end by the time of Capone's downfall, but the Windy City had emerged during the Great Depression as a center of wanton criminality. John Dillinger and his gang of bank robbers operated from here, and it was in the city that Dillinger would eventually be killed in 1934. His sometime associate, Babyface Nelson, real name Lester Joseph Gillis, also worked with his gang out of Chicago. Nelson would only eventually be stopped when the FBI engaged in a full-blown clash with him and his gang in the suburbs of Chicago on the 27th of November 1934, an event so violent it became known as the Battle of Barrington. Lots of others like Alvin Karpis and Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, who went on crime sprees around the Midwest and engaged in actions such as the Kansas City Massacre, when 4 law enforcement officers were killed in Kansas on the 17th of June 1933, also operated out of Chicago for lengthy periods of time. Thus, what Al Capone did was change the very culture of criminality in Chicago in the 1920s in a way which the government and average Chicagoans were still dealing with long after Capone himself had fallen from power. Al Capone was one of the most iconic of the Prohibition-era gangsters. Though he is entirely associated with Chicago, he was actually born and grew up in Brooklyn, New York. There, he was just one of many Italian-American youths who saw that adhering to the law would lead to a life of limited opportunities at a time when there was an immense amount of anti-immigrant sentiment towards Italians, Irish, Jews, and Germans in the United States. It was these same sentiments which, in part, led to the prohibition of alcohol in 1920 as a way of undermining the economic fortunes of these communities. By then, Capone was already a gangster. Having served his apprenticeship in New York, he headed out to Chicago under Johnny Torrio's wing. A decade of immense violence followed, as a drug and alcohol-addled Capone sought to destroy his rivals amongst the Irish-American gangs in the city, led by Dean O'Banion and others like Bugs Moran. His actions were needlessly inflammatory, notably the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, an act which sundered his ties to several Chicago politicians who were being paid by Capone to protect him from the FBI and the federal government. It was this lack of caution and subtlety which ultimately doomed him, whereas figures like Charles Lucky Luciano, who emerged as heads of the New York Mafia during the same era, did their level best to avoid any publicity. This, combined with his contraction of syphilis, ensured that Capone's time at the top of the underworld and his life itself were cut short.
What do you think of Al Capone? Was he a modern-day Robin Hood? Or was he a cold-blooded killer and gangster, one whose taste for the high life inflicted a lot of violence on Chicago in the 1920s and eventually led to his downfall? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Al Capone rose to power with a deadly combination of raw brutality and brains. He wanted the public to love him, but those who dared to cross him knew better.
Scarface Al Capone was a very, very evil man.
For the big fellow, killing was just part of his business plan. A plan to become the CEO of organized crime in Chicago.
Al Capone was not stupid. Hell, if he was a person who took a legal job, he'd be head of General Motors.
But as king of the bootleggers during Prohibition, Scarface Al became more of a celebrity than any mere corporate executive. He became the most famous gangster in the world. Alphonse Capone was a first-generation American, born January 17, 1899. His parents had many dreams when they left Naples for America. But when they settled in Brooklyn, the Capones found hardship. They lived first in a tenement in the crime-filled Navy Yard district. Life was rough for the Capones as they struggled to escape the waterfront. They finally moved, when Al was 10, to a better neighborhood.
He had a perfectly fine mother and father. His mother was devoutly religious to the end of her life. His father was a perfectly respectable barber. No reason to believe that any of the children would grow up to be anything other than perfectly respectable children, and they all grew up to be criminals.
Al's criminal path started early. He joined the toughest local gangs, stole things, and when necessary, used his fists. Young Al had flair. He was a cut above the punks who roamed the neighborhood with him.
When he saw an elderly widow's washboard being stolen when he was a kid, he organized a kid gang to go get it, to retrieve it, to beat up the other kids who stole it, and to return it to her, and then to lead a parade, a sort of a celebratory parade afterwards, in which he could portray himself and play the hero. So even at a very young age, even pre-adolescent, you can sort of begin to see the outlines of the Al Capone who grew up with a kind of a Robin Hood legend.
Capone learned more on the street than he ever did in school. He dropped out in 6th grade after smacking his teacher and in turn getting a thrashing from the principal. What he learned was how to shoot, first with a pool cue, then with a gun. Capone caused trouble with his buddies, but he also helped support his big family. Al tried the straight life, working in a munitions factory, as a pin setter in a bowling alley, and as a cloth cutter in a bookbindery.
He also, as a sideline, became a bouncer out in Coney Island in a bar known as the Harvard Inn, which is kind of a joke because it was owned by a gangster named Frankie Yale. That's where Capone really got his first taste of mob life or gangster life in New York.
It was also where a small-time hoodlum, Frank Galluccio, shielded his little sister, Lena, from Capone's advances and marked 18-year-old Al for life.
Capone came over to the table, bent over, and said to Lena, loud enough so that the people at the next table swiveled their heads in surprise at the language, which was strange. Honey, you got a beautiful ass, and I mean that as a compliment, really.
Defending his sister's honor, Galluccio pulled out a knife and slashed the left side of Capone's face, giving rise to the nickname he hated, Scarface. Capone was ashamed of the scars, sometimes using powder to hide them, preferring to be photographed from the right side, and saying the scars were the result of a war injury. These formative years were when Capone caught the eye of a sharp Brooklyn mobster 17 years his senior. Johnny Torrio would become Capone's role model. Torrio moved to Chicago to run things for Vice Lord Big Jim Colosimo. Big Jim controlled a string of gambling dens and whorehouses. Colosimo's nightclub, just south of downtown, was where the action was. Entertainers, gangsters, and politicians crowded the joint. Big Jim's empire swelled. Torrio needed a lieutenant with brains as well as brawn, so he recruited Capone. With the imminent passage of Prohibition, Al would be an asset to Torrio.
People he knew weren't going to stop drinking, and this opened up a brand new tax-free business to him.
Al Capone, only 19, had just become a father and husband, in that order. He married an Irish girl, May Coughlin, who was 2 years older. Al, May, and their baby came to Chicago in 1919. The city would never be the same. In the roaring 20s, Chicago was synonymous with corruption. Wild nightlife, rampant crime, and flowing booze. When Prohibition became the law in January 1920, it was a special invitation for 20-year-old Al Capone to scheme, move in, take over, and kill anyone who got in his way. Within a few years, Capone would be running a criminal organization the likes of which Chicago had never seen. But first, he had some things to learn from his boss, Johnny Torrio.
Torrio was Capone's mentor. It was coming up through the ranks, being attractive to the boss, having the boss say, this is someone who might succeed me one day. I'm going to bring him along.
You started out in one of the houses of prostitution, either as a bartender slash bouncer slash pimp slash roper, There's stories of supposedly Capone standing outside. In front of one of the houses, just saying to passersby, "Hey buddy, we got some nice girls inside."
The hot spot where Capone worked was Colosimo's nightclub, watering hole for the city's high rollers. With Prohibition, Torrio saw dollar signs. Bootlegging was his answered prayer, but his boss, Big Jim Colosimo, thought he was rich enough and didn't need a new racket.
Without Big Jim, Torrio couldn't expand. Exit Big Jim. But someone had to do it, and it was Capone who was the one who was chosen to arrange it.
Al hired his former New York boss, Frankie Yale, to do the killing. Big Jim was rubbed out in May of 1920 in the lobby of his own club. The style of this hit was to become a hallmark of Capone's murders, planned, deliberate, and witnesses who had sudden amnesia. Now, Torrio and Capone could take over and cash in on bootlegging. Capone had the right instincts, but he still needed some polish.
Torrio took the rough edges off of Capone. Aside from everything else, he insisted that he go to night school to improve his accent. He must have had a Brooklyn accent, but evidently he ended up without that kind of an accent. The people who knew him later in life said, no, he had no particular accent at all.
Capone rose quickly through the ranks of the underworld. He never wanted to be thought of as a criminal, but rather as a gentleman, with a passion for opera and the finer things money could buy.
Well, he was a very snappy dresser for those days, but not exactly in the Brooks Brothers mode. He went to yellow and green were his dominant fashion statement colors, with a milky white Borsalino fedora that was a gem. He wore a huge 11.5 carat pinky ring that cost $50,000. He wore Italian glove silk underwear.
His style earned him the nickname he liked, Snorky, meaning sharp dresser. Al was flamboyant, his 5'10.5", 175 pounds, commanding attention as he and his gang swept into nightclubs.
He used to come in with 4 or 5 guys, and they'd all sit at the table, and then the girls would come over, the hostesses in the club. They'd all come around, make a big fuss over him, and he'd give them money. You know, he was very liberal.
Oh, sure, I met him. He was a very nice person, as to know him, you know. And what they said, he never did anything. It was his people that did it, like his men that he had or whatever, do this dirty work.
Many people only believed in Capone's good nature. They didn't see evil, just generosity. Like the time he spilled a drink on a showgirl's new dress.
But it was all wet, and I thought, my God, what am I going to do, you know, like for the rest of the night? So he did give me some money to go and have it taken care of. I didn't want to take it, and he says, no, you take this. He gave me, I think, $25, I think it was.
Well, if he was sitting at the table, he'd call me over, and then every once in a while, when he would come to the club or something, he'd say, get the kid up on the stage and let him do the Charleston, you know, and I'd get a $5 bill. And that was terrific, you know.
Capone's family thought he was terrific, too. When his father died in 1920, Al, the dutiful son, brought his family to Chicago. Together, the Capones lived in a 15-room house on the South Side. He brought his brothers into the rackets and supported his sisters comfortably. To the day she died, his younger sister, Mafalda, defended him, writing, I know nothing about his activities outside the family and do not recall any conversations about business matters. Outside the family, he was a different guy.
He was regularly unfaithful. He was a lusty man who was dealing with prostitutes and sampled the wares. He would get drunk. He would be away from home for long periods of time. He, in effect, would live away from home.
When he wasn't out drinking, gambling, or whoring, Capone studied his boss, Torrio. He learned how Chicago was divvied up and how to bring gangland together to fill the city's thirst for alcohol. In 1922, under Torrio's design, local mobsters made a peace agreement. everyone would get a cut of the action.
That was Torrio's modus operandi, to try and get everybody together and agree. And Capone learned that from Torrio. I think Capone learned to suppress his perhaps naturally violent instincts.
This strategy turned bootlegging into big business. Supply was controlled, from breweries to backyard stills. Saloon owners, if they were smart, bought Capone's beer.
If you didn't, they would come back and tell you, you better take their beer. This happened over and over again. If you didn't do that again, they would bomb your place and they would blow out the windows. And then they would offer to lend you the money to repair it. Well, nobody else would give you the money to repair your place. Of course, once you did that, you were in effect in business with the Capone organization.
The government's estimate is that they took in, on average, $120 million a year in sales from liquor, prostitution, and gambling, basically. So they were the equivalent of a probably medium-sized corporation. And it was run in many ways like a business. There were guys with specific functions, like in charge of beer truck repair, in charge of brewery construction, in charge of brewery management.
Capone was a brilliant businessman and a brilliant organizer. He couldn't invest money in the conventional sense because that would supply the government with a trail to his organization. So it was an all-cash business that he was in, which was the trinity of gambling, prostitution, and vice.
Capone also guaranteed protection from the law by bribing cops and politicians.
Al Capone himself once estimated that 50% of the Chicago police force worked for him. So that's a big part of doing business. Otherwise, you wouldn't operate for a minute if you weren't getting protection.
1922 was the year that Capone finally got officially noticed by the Chicago press. In the early hours of August 30th, he was arrested after a night of boozing. Capone's temper erupted when the car he was driving slammed into a taxi, badly injuring the driver. He pulled a gun and threatened the taxi driver, waving around a fake sheriff's badge. When the real police showed up, Capone was arrested. He taunted the officer, boasting that he'd fix this thing. Easy. He did. The charges were dropped. Word that Al walked got around fast. His legend was growing. Now just 23 years old, Al became Torrio's partner at the top of the crime world. While attempts to quench the public's thirst stepped up, so did greed. In 1923, the gangland peace negotiated under Torrio shattered. Chicago's notorious beer wars began and grabbed headlines nationwide. Blood flowed and bombs exploded from September through December. For Capone's enemies, it ended in death.
The only thing these guys would do would be to respond with violence. And violence is sort of a currency for them. It's what they use to get their way.
During the entire Prohibition era, 700 people were murdered in Chicago in bootlegging or Prohibition-related crimes.
Torrio and Capone won the first round of the gang wars. Confident that control was restored, Torrio went on a 4-month cruise, leaving Capone in charge, giving him license to become the most powerful man in the city. 1924 ushered in a new era for Al Capone. In Chicago, corruption took a detour when a law and order man was elected mayor. Despite his personal distaste for Prohibition, he enforced it. So Al set his sights on opportunities for growth in the suburbs, starting with Cicero.
It only made him seem to be a much stronger criminal leader. By expanding into the suburbs, he was really able to seal up Chicago lock, stock, and barrel for his own.
Cicero was made to order for Capone's gang. It was a working-class bedroom community of 60,000 where bribery worked like a charm. From suburban headquarters at the Hawthorne Hotel, Al cut deals with local officials to operate beer and gambling joints. To keep his power base, Capone rigged the Cicero election. His men shot, beat up, and held voters hostage who were opposed to mob rule. On Election Day, April 1st, 1924, the Capone ticket was victorious. But Al suffered one major defeat. His 30-year-old brother Frank was killed in a shootout with Chicago police.
The death of Frank Capone, I think, had a profound effect on Al and turned him from a kind of low-key Johnny Torrio type of racketeer into a much more desperate and violent hoodlum. It made him feel that his own life could be cut short at any time and that he would go for as much as he could.
The week after Frank's death, Capone opened Cicero's first betting parlor, the Hawthorne Smoke Shop. Capone always said he had bad luck with horses, but now it didn't matter, because he got a hefty take of racetrack profits, especially when the races were fixed. To his friends, he doled out hot tips like candy.
He and his bodyguards were walking around, and he comes by the racetrack, and he says, "Hey, kid, how you doing?" He says, "You see number 6? He said, "He's going to win." So one of his goons came over and slipped a ticket in my pocket. It was a $5 ticket. The horse went off at 60 to 1, and with my $5, I think I collected something like $300 and something dollars.
Capone and his boss, Johnny Torrio, now had their hands in the till of 160 gambling joints and 123 saloons just in Cicero. Not everyone, however, was so impressed. A crusading 21-year-old newspaper editor, Robert St. John, was disgusted. In his paper, he exposed town leaders on the mob payroll and detailed a Capone brothel with a death chamber run by Al's older brother, Ralph.
And of course, that made me an enemy of the Capones. As I was going to my office early one morning, I glanced up and saw a big black touring car come roaring toward the intersection. This car screeched to a halt and 4 men jumped out. I recognized Ralph Capone immediately, and they headed for me, and I was halfway across the intersection. I dropped to the ground, curled up, and put my head between my legs, and they gave me a real working over. Blackjacks and billies, but the interesting weapon they used was a cake of soap in a knitted woolen sock. This was one of the Capone's favorite murder instruments, because if using this instrument, if they hit the base in the neck and the base of the skull, you can kill a person.
This time, though, it didn't work. St. John survived and was hospitalized.
And when I got out to pay my bill, the cashier of the hospital said, "Oh, your bill was paid this morning." And I said, "Oh, there's some mistake. It can't have been paid." "Oh, yes." And they described the man who had paid it. A slight scar on his left cheek.
It was Capone. To add insult to injury, Big Al had also bought controlling interest in St. John's newspaper. Capone's takeover of other suburbs was easier. In Chicago Heights, he helped local mobsters win their gang war. In return, Capone made a financial killing, gaining an interstate bootlegging network.
At one time, it was reported that Chicago Heights was worth around $36 million to him. By having the Chicago Heights people behind him, his network would virtually double in size.
Capone joined forces with the Chicago Heights mob, and in a town where corruption ruled, the big fella was royalty.
And there were times when he'd ride in an open car and people would come up to him and shake his hand, and he would treat people like they were his friends, like they were family, and because of that, they had a lot of respect for him.
That respect paid off. While Capone's boss, Johnny Torrio, was away on his cruise, Al expanded operations, formed new allies, and reaped the profits.
When Torrio came back, if there had ever been any question in Torrio's mind that Al Capone was the man to succeed him, that ended it.
There was also no question about Capone's explosive temper or loyalty. On May 8th, when Al's accountant, Greasy Thumb Jack Guzik, whined that he'd been kicked around by a local bootlegger, Al took aim. He unloaded a 6-shooter into the culprit's head, point blank, in front of 3 witnesses. No one forgot it, but no one would say they remembered it. Al went into hiding, but later turned himself into the police, saying he was out of town the day of the murder. Once again, he beat the rap.
There was no way to get Capone on any of the substantive charges. You couldn't get a jury. They knew what would happen to them if they voted a conviction against a gangster. And they said as much. People would ask to be excused. "I'd have to carry a gun the rest of my life," said one of them asking to be excused.
Capone knew it. He went about his business, ordering the elimination of people who refused to cooperate.
The one-way ride was the preferred method. Let's get him in a car and let's take him to a nice secluded place and shoot him and dump him out of the car. So there are no 1 witnesses, 2 innocent bystanders, or any particular problems beyond it.
Capone's biggest problem that had to be taken care of was Northside gangster and well-known florist Dion O'Banion. O'Banion had plenty of power and money, but wanted more. He made a fatal mistake when he tried to swindle Capone and his boss, Torrio, on a brewery deal. On the morning of May 19th, Torrio got arrested in a prohibition raid O'Banion knew about. Torrio was on his way to the slammer, but not before he'd get revenge. Once again, New York triggerman Frankie Yale got the nod. Yale would do the job with two local hitmen. They decided to kill O'Banion on November 10th when he was busy preparing flowers for a gangster funeral. When the three hitmen walked into the flower shop, O'Banion reached out to shake Yale's hand. Yale held on as the others pumped O'Banion full of lead. It was the end of O'Banion and the beginning of a bloody gang war. That's because in January 1925, two of O'Banion's men, George Bugs Moran and Jaime Weiss, tried to avenge their boss's murder and went gunning for Capone and Torrio. They missed Al, but managed to ambush Torrio. Torrio recovered and was sent to prison on the prohibition charge. In March, while serving time, he announced his retirement. To no one's surprise, leadership of the mob was passed to Capone, then just 26 years old. The youthful mob boss was front-page news. He liked being in the limelight. When accused of a crime, he'd call a press conference.
And he'd say, hey, look, fella, I had nothing to do with this. Please, get off of my back.
But the truth was Capone had everything to do with Chicago's increasingly vicious gang violence. Al was now a moving target. He shielded himself in his new high-security headquarters in the plush Metropole Hotel. Secret tunnels helped Al and his men make quick getaways. He never went anywhere alone. Capone had more security than President Calvin Coolidge. He rode in a $20,000 customized Cadillac limousine that was more like a tank. It was 7 tons, armor-plated, with bulletproof glass. The back window could be yanked when gunmen had to fire at their enemies. Capone now had his share.
They kept encroaching on each other's territory. Wasn't supposed to happen, it did. They shot each other. Capone was going to have to eliminate one by one the opposition again. Bring one by one, bring them all in line.
All Capone had to do now was give the orders. He did, and he never looked back. "1925 echoed with gunshots. Violence was escalating with no end in sight. Al Capone and his enemies were fighting with a new weapon, the Tommy gun.
It immediately changed the rules of the game because they were much more violent than pistols. Once you combined a machine gun with a moving car, you had a lethal instrument, the likes of which had never been seen before. So they upped the ante in all the gangster wars.
Chicago was, for better or worse, kind of the example par excellence of gangland and gangland violence. The violence was much more noticeable and spectacular here than, say, in New York or elsewhere.
Capone, however, brought violence to New York. He went there in late December to take his son to a doctor. Then he gave his buddy Frankie Yale a Christmas present, slaughtering 3 of Yale's enemies. Capone and his men were arrested. As usual, all the witnesses were silent, and the charges were dropped. Al came back to Chicago, to 1926 and the continuing gang war. The stakes were getting higher when on April 27th, Al led a 5-car assault on a rival gang. Outside a Cicero bar, Capone and his men opened fire. The tally, 3 wounded, 3 dead, including a 25-year-old assistant state's attorney. Bill McSwiggan had stayed close with his childhood buddies who were Capone's enemies. There was an outcry over the murder of a public official, so Capone vanished.
In fact, he went to Lansing, Michigan, where he hid out at a little cottage with his mistress for the summer until the heat was off. After a while, he began negotiations with the Illinois state authorities and delivered himself into their custody.
Despite a major investigation, a coroner's inquest, and the convening of 6 grand juries, Capone was never indicted. Once again, he got off, proclaiming his innocence. Capone appeared untouchable.
In fact, one day he went to a courthouse, a jail, and a police station, asking if there was any policeman there, any cop, any detective, any judge who wanted to arrest him. Nobody did. Nobody dared. And of course, he brought a reporter around with him to show that he was not a wanted man in Chicago.
I was the only photographer, and the paper had the only reporter with him. And we went to all these places. And all these places wanted nothing to do with him.
Not everyone stayed out of Capone's way. Trigger-happy Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran traded shots with Al all during the summer of 1926, but none hit their mark. The most spectacular attempt of all came in late September. Capone was having lunch at the Hawthorne restaurant when a 10-car caravan filled with Weiss's men roared around the corner. Machine gun fire split the air. Capone leapt up and started to run.
His bodyguard, it registered on him before it registered on Capone that something is wrong and there's going to be more. They must have been blanks to make us find out what's happening. He dove forward, knocked Capone to the floor, and was holding him down when the rest of the cars came by with real machine guns, and they just shot up the entire block. Finally, a gunman got out, knelt in the doorway, and sprayed the whole place.
5,000 bullets blasted the coffee shop in just under 10 minutes. It was destroyed, but amazingly no one was killed. Capone paid hospital bills for the one person injured. Then he turned his attention to getting rid of Weiss. Capone ordered his men to rent rooms that overlooked the Weiss-Moran headquarters. When they spotted Weiss crossing the street, they opened fire. One more problem eliminated. Soon after, Bugs Moran became leader of the North Side Gang. Capone sent him condolences about Weiss, denying any involvement with his assassination. In late October, Capone made a peace agreement with Moran and other gang leaders. Al later said, "There's plenty of beer business for everybody. Why kill each other over it?" At age 27, Capone's power in the underworld was growing, but he craved recognition as an upstanding businessman. After all, he employed more than 400 people and controlled a multi-million-dollar operation.
He didn't go running around with a machine gun shooting people out of fast-moving cars. You would find him in his office, surrounded by junior executives with the phones jangling, 3 people waiting to get a little bit of his time for an executive decision. That was his working day. That's the kind of criminal he was. In other words, he was a modern criminal.
1927 started as a good year for Al by all measures. The U.S. Attorney's Office would estimate his organization took in $105 million that year, all from unlawful enterprises. One of his allies, Big Bill Thompson, was voted back in as mayor of Chicago, giving control of the city, in effect, to Capone. When things were going his way, Al tried to relax. He took his son to baseball games. He boxed. He liked to have a good time. Capone said he was tired of being underappreciated in his role as public servant, that he needed a getaway. So he bought one. In January 1928, Capone paid $40,000 in cash for a 14-room mansion on Palm Island, Florida, near Miami. He invested another $100,000 in improvements to make it a paradise. Still, this wouldn't shelter Capone from problems starting to brew in his own organization. Al learned that his favorite New York hitman, Frankie Yale, was stealing East Coast booze shipments. Loyalty was paramount to Capone, and he felt betrayed. Yale had killed often for Capone. Now the tables were turned. On July 1st, 1928, Yale was the victim, chased and shot down in New York by Al's gunmen. Capone still had one significant rival, Bugs Moran. Moran's gang was hijacking the mob's whiskey. Capone was fed up with Moran's antics, and at the end of December, he went to Florida to mastermind what would become his most infamous crime.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was one of the most fascinating and complicated hits in the history of gangland in this country, probably also the most celebrated.
On the morning of February 14th, 1929, Moran was late getting to his warehouse. His men were there waiting for a shipment of whiskey. Strangers walked in, 2 dressed as cops, 2 others in plain clothes. Moran's men, thinking it was a raid, put their hands up, turned and faced the wall, and instantly were mowed down. An inquest was assembled to investigate. Moran and others pointed the finger at Capone, but Al had an airtight alibi. He was in Florida in a meeting with the district attorney in Miami at the time of the shootings. Once again, with no one willing to testify, the case was closed.
No one knows for sure who did it. My theory is they thought the last person to go in, who looked quite a bit like Moran and was wearing the same outfit that Moran wore, a light overcoat with a darker brown fedora. I think they thought he was Moran.
The city and the country was sickened by this killing, but the bloodshed wasn't over. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was the most graphic show of violence yet. Now, there was no escape for Capone. He was to become the target of criminals and lawmen alike. Public disgust with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre had barely subsided when Al Capone made his next move to clean house. In May 1929, Al's informants told him hitmen John Scalise and Albert Anselmi and another gunman were conspiring to murder him. Capone invited them to a roadhouse in Indiana.
He got their confidence and threw a banquet for them, and they had a wonderful evening drinking and eating, and then at the end of the night, then the tables turned and he accused them of treachery, and he and his bodyguards beat him to death with baseball bats, before shooting him, of course.
I photographed the 3 bodies that were found in the brushes in Hammond. Their heads were smashed. They were bad. The police picked up the bodies and they took them to a mortuary, and we had taken pictures of them covered up. You only show a little bit of their face.
It was a really hideous crime. In fact, it was so hideous that even other gangsters began to distance themselves from Capone at that time.
Suddenly, trouble was everywhere for Capone. Public sentiment against him was growing. His life was in danger. There was a $50,000 contract out on him. Al figured the only place he'd be safe was in a jail, away from Chicago. So he set it up. On May 16th, leaving a movie theater in Philadelphia, Capone and his bodyguard were arrested for carrying concealed weapons. The scheme went haywire when the judge threw the book at them. The verdict was stiff: a year in jail. Al tried everything to get out early, from bribery to giving money to local charities at Christmas. It didn't work. So Al used his phone privileges to run his gang, long distance from jail. The news he got from home was bad. Capone and his organization were now a target of the federal government. President Hoover wanted to see Big Al behind bars for a long time. He kept asking his aides, "Have you got that fellow Capone yet?" The IRS was working on it, closing in on his gang.
While he was still in jail in Philadelphia, Ralph Capone was gotten and was sent away. Jack Guzik was sent away. Frank Nitti, who was Capone's number 2, was sent away, all on income tax.
When Capone left prison in March 1930, new problems awaited him. He had just been named public enemy number 1 by the Chicago Crime Commission, but he wanted people to think of him as a good guy. The country was entering the Depression, so Capone responded, opening Chicago's first soup kitchen, feeding 3,000 hungry people a day.
If it wasn't for our friend Al Capone roping open this here White House on 935 South State Street, we wouldn't eat.
Capone's generosity made him somewhat of a folk hero in the media, but in June, Al lost one of his major pipelines to the press. Jake Lingle, who covered crime and politics for the Chicago Tribune and was on Capone's payroll, was gunned down by one of Al's rivals.
When I looked at him, I said, "Oh my God, that's Jake." Well, I took a picture too and then called the office. I said, "Jake Lingle was just killed. He was on his way to the racetrack, and the only reason I know that is because he had a racing farm near him."
Capone avenged Lingle's death and began to deal with his newest enemy, the federal government. Pop culture has left the impression that a group of Prohibition agents shut down Capone. The Untouchables, led by Elliot Ness, in reality, did little more than stage a couple of raids for the press. The IRS taxmen, who had already put away Capone's top lieutenants, were the government's real heroes. But it wasn't easy. Legally, Al didn't own a thing.
He couldn't buy real estate. He put his house in Florida in his wife's name. He put his house in Chicago in his mother's name. He put his car in his wife's name. He didn't keep ledgers, but some of his bookkeepers kept ledgers. And eventually the IRS discovered the ledgers, was able to decipher the ledgers, and was able to track some of the codes in the ledgers to Capone's old bookkeepers, and then track them back to Capone himself.
It took 5 years to bring all the evidence together. On June 5th, 1931, the man known as Alphonse Capone was indicted on 22 counts of income tax evasion dating from 1925 through 1929. The prosecution, led by United States Attorney George E.Q. Johnson, said Capone owed Uncle Sam just over $215,000. Capone did everything in his power to control the outcome of this case.
Capone hired 5 hoodlums to come out here from New York to kill my father. And they were spotted here, and the Secret Service had tailed them enough to stop this, and Capone was convinced you better send them home. This was just before the trial. We had a squad car, a Chicago squad car in front of our house on the south side of Chicago, and one in the back part of the house, and my father had Secret Service with him all the time doing this thing, but it's the only way to keep him alive.
Capone tried to plea bargain, but the judge wouldn't hear of it. Then Capone opened his wallet to buy off the jury. But when the judge found out, he switched jurors moments before the trial was set to begin on October 7th. There was no real defense for Capone. With so many hardworking Americans paying taxes on small salaries and so many out of work, there wasn't much sympathy for Big Al, the big spender.
The jury was out 9 hours. There were 22 ballots taken. And as we know by history, that Al Capone was found guilty of income tax evasion. Not murder, not pimping, not all the dirty things he did or killing, but income tax. But that was the only way he could be prosecuted, and that's what my father did.
Capone was sentenced to 11 years behind bars, the stiffest penalty of any tax case to date.
It's safe to assume that Capone never expected to be convicted, or if he was convicted, he expected to spend perhaps a year or 2 in jail, not 10 or 11 years.
As he left court, he looked to the photographers and said, "Get enough, boys. You won't be seeing me for a long time." Capone appealed the verdict, but lost, and went from Chicago's Cook County Jail to federal prison in Atlanta. In August 1934, he was sent to the Rock, Alcatraz. At Alcatraz, Capone kept to himself. His old ways didn't work there. In 1936, a fellow prisoner tried to kill him, stabbing Capone in the back with a pair of scissors. In 1938, Al was officially diagnosed as suffering the degenerative effects of syphilis, picked up from one of his prostitute girlfriends. His mind was going. Capone needed medical treatment, and in January 1939, he was transferred to the Federal Correctional Center outside Los Angeles. In November, he was released from prison and sent to Union Memorial Hospital in Baltimore. Al returned to Florida in March 1940. Syphilis ate away at Capone for the rest of his life. At age 48, on January 25, 1947, Alphonse Capone died of cardiac arrest. His body was taken to Chicago for burial.
Well, it was a very cold day in January of 1947. In fact, it was 11 below zero at the time. It was a huge funeral because hundreds of persons turned out. There was an edict by Anthony J. Accardo, who was the boss of the mob and had been a former bodyguard for Al Capone, to all crime syndicate gangsters to show up at the funeral and pay their respects to Al Capone, even though Al Capone had no power and was helpless when he died.
Capone's run as a mob kingpin was over, but his fingerprints on crime and Chicago's reputation lives on.
There's no doubt but that the Capone era established the underpinnings of what is now the Chicago organized crime family. It gave the mob, a start here in the Windy City. And that beginning led to a zenith in activity in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. There was and continues to be in some form an alliance between the hoodlums that began under Capone and elected public officials.
My father made many speeches and made this point about Al Capone upon numerous occasions, that had this man taken all his energy, talent, and basic intelligence, and guts, if you will, and directed this energy down legitimate avenues, he'd been a very successful businessman. There's no doubt about it. He had a peculiar charm about him that he could use when he wanted to use, and this, of course, was deceptive. But as we all know, he didn't use his talent in that direction, and as a result, people died, people were hurt, and Chicago lost its reputation.
Of course, Capone is world famous. Wherever you go, if you mention Chicago, people instantly associate that city with Capone.
There are lots of celebrities. Very, very few of them become allusions. So their name means the same thing to everyone who hears it. Capone was one.
He never impressed me of anything except that he was a bad guy. And the reason that maybe that I felt that way is because I happen to be an Italian. And anybody that hurts an Italian person, I feel hurt. And so, let's end this. To me, he was a bum.